So our next lab is on solubility, and it's a pretty short lab, only worth 5 points, but it's going to get us to think about things like intermolecular forces again. So maybe you've heard before when you talk about solubility this phrase, like dissolves like. And fundamentally, we're asking questions about the polarity of substances. And we're looking at different solvents today and then a variety of different alcohols. And we're asking how soluble are those alcohols as solutes in different solvents. And so one of the solvents that we're looking at is water. And hopefully you can think about water as being a very polar molecule. Reminder again, how do you know that something is polar? Well, if you can have polar bonds, and the shape of the molecule does not allow those dipoles to cancel out, then you have a polar molecule. So, and how do you tell if you have polar bonds? Two atoms that are connected together that are not the same and not carbon and hydrogen are going to allow you to have polar bonds. But again, making sure that those polar bonds don't cancel one another out, if the shape of the molecule is such that they cancel out, allows you to have a polar molecule. So water is sort of like a prototypical polar molecule. And then things like hexanes are prototypical nonpolar molecules. Remember, hexanes existing totally of carbon and hydrogen atoms either have carbons bonded to carbons, those are the same atoms, so that's not a polar bond, or carbons bonded to hydrogen. And again, carbons bonded to hydrogen do not have different enough of an electronegativity to allow that bond to be polar. So hydrocarbons, that's what we call these species, are nonpolar. So here's sort of the two extremes of polar and nonpolar solvents. So we're asking the question, alcohols. So this is a functional group that you've learned before. So an alcohol is basically an OH group that's attached to the rest of the molecule. So the rest of the molecule can, as we'll see in our examples here, have a variety of different numbers of carbon and hydrogen atoms. And so that's going to be key here. But that OH group in an alcohol functional group is a polar functional group. There is a dipole that we have here because that OH bond is polar. Usually that R group is part of a carbon atom and the rest of the molecule. So this is going to be another polar bond, the dipole pointing towards the more electronegative oxygen. So this part of the molecule is going to be polar, but depending on what that R group is, what the rest of the molecule looks like is going to determine whether that alcohol is more soluble in something like water or something like hexanes. So again, the question is how polar or nonpolar is that R group? Because that's ultimately going to determine whether or not this alcohol wants to hang out more with a polar solvent like water or a nonpolar solvent like hexanes. So again, this like dissolves like is something that's a simple concept to think about. Two polar substances, polar solute, polar solvent, are going to want to be with each other, just like two nonpolar solute and solvent pairs. But let's think about this solubility piece from a little bit of a different angle in terms of intermolecular forces. So again, when we have solvent just by itself as pure solvent, there's going to be intermolecular forces between those solvent molecules. Same thing with the solute by itself. Now in this case, we have two liquid substances. The solvent is liquid and so is the solute. We've typically thought of solutes as being as a solid that we dissolve in a liquid solvent. But in this case, we have a liquid solute. So the solute has interactions for other solutes. The solvent has interaction for other solvent molecules. And then the question happens when we mix these together, what happens? And at its core, what we're doing is exchanging intermolecular forces. So we have to break solvent-solvent interactions, we have to break solute-solute interactions, and then we're making new intermolecular forces in our solution. So always remember, breaking intermolecular forces takes energy, and when we make intermolecular forces, we get energy back out. So at its core, whether or not this process happens has a lot to do with how costly it is to break these interactions and what we get back when we solvate the solute by the solvent. Lots of S words that we have there. But again, making these new intermolecular forces is going to give us back energy. And the question is does this gain outweigh the costs of what we break apart? So at the end of the day, too, we've got polar or nonpolar solvents, polar or nonpolar solutes, in this case, those alcohols, and we need to think about what we're breaking apart and then getting back as we make a solution. Okay, so expanding on this just a little bit more, again, these new intermolecular forces are going to be best when they match. So again, that's going to happen when we have solute and solvent both being polar. So a polar solute-solvent match and a nonpolar solute-solvent match. Those are going to be matches, and so that's going to be a soluble sort of situation. In that case, we're going to have solute be soluble in solvent. If we have a mismatch here, if we've got, in this case, a nonpolar alcohol in water, that's not going to want to make a solution. That's going to be insoluble. If we have a more polar alcohol in, say, the hexane as our solvent, that's not going to create a soluble solution. Okay, so it's still fundamentally a like dissolves like, right? When we have a match between solute and solvent intermolecular forces and polarity, or between nonpolar in this case, that's going to be a match. That's a like dissolves like. Okay, one last thing to sort of highlight here. I have a blank space in the middle here because we've got sort of two extremes of our solubility of our solvents. We've got a very polar solvent like water, a very non-polar solvent like hexane. Can we have somebody in the middle who's kind of a nice hybrid, maybe has aspects of both? Acetone is going to be like that. Acetone, and having these CH3 groups here on the end, is going to be something that is going to contribute non-polar character to it, but then we've got this C double bonded to O. Remember, that's a carbonyl. That's not a functional group, but that is a component that's a very polar bond in a molecule. So acetone is something that has features of both. Okay, so you're going to want to keep that in mind as you go through. This lab is a pretty straightforward lab. Directions basically just have you taking and putting some alcohol or some solvent into a test tube and then dropping in some alcohol. I'm going to pretend like this is a little test tube here. When you put these in and you put your drops of your alcohol in, here's a great way. This is called the flick method to try to mix your stuff. You can just sort of sit here and go like this with your test tube. It'll be a great way to try to mix your solute, your alcohol, with your solvent and ask the question, do they seem to mix together and then stay mixed, or do they mix together but then you can watch them separate back out, much like you'd have with like an oil and vinegar salad dressing, okay? So looking at your sheet that you have here, right? Here's the whole list of possible alcohols that we have. Solubility in water, solubility in acetone, solubility in hexanes. So you've got some spaces here. We're sort of on a 3-point scale where you can say not soluble, soluble, or partially soluble. You're just going to put some qualitative comments here. You should be able to think about and maybe predict what we're going to see here. Again, these are skeletal structures. So again, the more lines that we have here represents more carbon atoms. The more hydrocarbon we have in our alcohol, the more non-polar that it is. So lots of ways that we can probably predict what we might see, but then you're going to write down what your experimental observations are. All right, and that's it for our solubility lab on alcohols.